Hello, I'm Bill Leipold, and welcome to this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. Joining me today is Jenny Kurtz, the Acting Director of the Office of Social Justice Education and Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Communities here at Rutgers University. Jenny, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're here today. First question, obviously, is yesterday President Obama signed into law finally protection for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks as inclusion underneath the hate crimes bill. What does that mean for folks here at Rutgers University and for the LGBT community?
Well, I think it's a great step forward. I know it's been a long time in the making, a very long time in the making, and so I think it's a huge accomplishment. I also hope that it speaks to future LGBTQ supportive initiatives that this administration will do, and I'm very confident that will happen. But I think while it's wonderful to have recourse, and it also is wonderful for raising visibility and awareness,
right.
I think still there needs to be so much more done with preventative measures where we don't have so many hate crimes against LGBTQ folks.
Well, that's a federal statute, so let's talk about Rutgers University.
Yes.
So I know that you've been involved for the past 2 years with the Gender Identity Task Force.
Yes. Can
you tell me a little bit about what they've been tackling on campus and how they're dealing with some transgender issues?
Sure. Well, the Gender Identity Task Force was convened by the Office of the Vice President in Student Affairs in 2005.
All right.
And was chaired by Cheryl Clark, who's been the active director of my office for many years. This year is in the role of the interim dean of students at Livingston campus.
All right.
Which is why I'm in the acting director role. Part of the goal was to bring together folks from different offices like Residence Life, Health Services, Recreation, the registrar's office, and talk about what are we doing well and what can we be doing better for transgender students on campus.
Well, let's go back. Let's take a step back, because I probably should have asked this first.
Okay.
Why don't you give us a little bit of an overview or definition of transgender folks? I think there might be some folks watching who may not understand what transgender means.
Sure. So the general assumption by dominant culture is you're born female or you're born male, and that if you're born female, you're going to grow up and you're going to be a girl and then a woman, ideally feminine, you know, in terms of dominant culture standards.
Right.
And if you're born a male, you're going to grow up, you're going to be a boy and then a man and presumably male.
Okay.
And then presumably heterosexual, because this is all interconnected.
Right.
So transgender folks would be someone who is maybe born a girl, and then as they grow up and evolve, their gender identity connects more, you know, they self-identify as a man or as a trans man, or vice versa, born a boy or assigned boy at birth. They grow up and self-identify as a woman or a trans woman. And I do want to make the distinction that some transgender folks want the modifier, I'm a trans man, I'm a trans woman, and some folks, after they transition or once they start self-identifying, want to be referred to only as a woman or a man.
All right. I do know that sometimes dealing with these issues can be complicated.
Yes.
And I know that Rutgers University is really well ranked in terms of being able to create an environment that's a little bit more accepting as well as embracing of folks who are transgender. What are some of the steps that we've taken to really deal with the transgender issue on campus and to make our environment more inviting?
Sure. Well, I know that in 2008, Rutgers joined nationally a rather small list of colleges and university that has gender identity and gender expression in the non-discrimination clause. And what that really means in real time is if a student starts to either comes to school identifying as transgender or more likely because of where they are developmentally, comes to school and starts to self-identify and make the transition once they're here. Like, I mean, I'm talking transition not even physically necessarily, but in terms of their own self-identification.
Okay, so we're talking spiritually, emotionally, mentally.
Spiritually, emotionally, changing pronouns, changing names.
Okay.
That they have support on campus. So if my name is Jenny on a roster and you're my professor and I now want to be called Joe, you need to respect that and respect my gender identity. And if you choose not to, or if you disagree with the concept of what it means to be transgender for whatever reason, I have some sort of recourse at the university. I have folks I can reach out to who can support me in making sure you treat me the way I want to be treated.
So if there are transgender students watching this who don't know about kind of your resource center or kind of how you can be helpful, what and which ways can you, be able to intercede with them, be able to interact with them, and be able to help them in a classroom situation situation, a situation in terms of being able to go into a restaurant across campus. Can you talk to some of those areas?
Absolutely. So one thing, Rutgers is a huge university, and that's fantastic, but that also means that potentially groups that are underrepresented in terms of numbers, like the transgender community, might be spread out and isolated in ways where they wouldn't organically meet each other, or because they are isolated, might not feel comfortable being out. So, you know, many folks in this room could have met more transgender folks than they're aware of, but they're reading them as a man or as a woman and not having that awareness. So a transgender student who contacts the office, which is actually now a center, which I guess I'll talk about in a minute, what I'd like to do is try to be someone who can help be a touch point for them. First of all, like a known face where they come to the office, and if they say, you know, I'm transgender, they don't have to do what they have to do a lot of times with like faculty members, which is educate me about what that means.
So you're looking for a safety space, someone who knows who they are, understands some of their issues, so it's kind of that space they can come to, take a breath.
Yes.
And then work with you to deal with some of the other issues that they may run into across campus.
I also work with the faculty and staff liaisons for LGBTQ students.
All right.
That's a wonderful program at Rutgers. We have, I think right now, about 50 staff and faculty members who go through yearly sort of training to be liaisons. Some of them self-identify as members of the community, and a lot of them self-identify as allies. But what I can do is if a student has a specific issue in someplace like residence life, where we have many liaisons, many very strong allies, I can help them connect with folks who might be able to, who I know who have done this work before, who might be able to support them, you know, in something that's residence hall related.
Right.
Or if they want to go to counseling services and they come to me and they say, I'm really concerned, I want to go to counseling services, but I self-identify as transgender, I can say honestly, well, I know that there are fantastic liaisons over there. I know that their staff receive training on these issues, that you won't be counseled out of self-identifying, that no one will push back, that people will be warm and receptive. And so I'm helpful. I think it's good to be able to sort of help them navigate, almost like a tour guide.
I was going to say, so it sounds to me as though, one, you're a strong advocate.
Yes.
It's a place where safety is there, but it's also one of those conversations where you're helping the transgender students network throughout the community to help them identify who's supportive, who's helpful, who they can go talk to.
Yes.
And to be able to do that. You had talked earlier about the fact that you had become a resource center.
Right.
Well, not you personally, but your center had become more of a resource center. So can you talk to me a little bit more about kind of what's happening there and what's going on now?
Sure. So for many years, several preceding my arrival on campus, we had an office for social justice education in LGBT communities on College Avenue.
Right.
And that was great, and the office did wonderful things, but what it wasn't was a resource center. And sort of nationally, some of the general standards that make something a resource center is the presence of some sort of student room or student lounge where students can be there informally, formally, have small programs, and also the presence of a library. So at the end of this September, we moved from College Ave to Livingston campus in Tillett Hall, room 247. And you know, now we have a student lounge, we have a library, and now that we're physically in the space, we can start doing the things to actually make space an active part of the campus community. Like, one thing I do whenever I meet a student who self-identifies as transgender, I say, you know, in the future, you know, how many folks on campus do you know? Do you know anybody? If I was to hold some sort of meet and greet for transgender students and allies and maybe some gender nonconforming students, would you be interested? And I save these emails, and so right now I think I have a critical mass, you know, albeit small. And so I've been trying to set up a time to do this sort of meet and greet in the center to help create community, because that's, I think, the biggest challenge.
No, for folks to meet each other, to be able to have that supporting relationship, to be able to do that. Can you give us a little overview at some of the issues that transgender students run into on campus?
Absolutely.
You had talked about the classroom, but what other issues might they, you know, take on while they're here?
Rutgers, and this is not unique to Rutgers by any stretch of the imagination, but you know, most college campuses are rigidly gendered. So meaning you go to residence life and you check if you're male or female, and then you get assigned a roommate based on your perceived or like legal gender identity. You are supposed to use bathrooms that correspond with your legal sex.
Right.
If you want to play sports, most of the sports are divided by sex. If you're interested in Greek life, most of those organizations are divided by sex. There are so many forms that somebody fills out on campus. I think some that are probably more necessary than others, where you check sex and it's male or female. What some schools do, and I think this is something maybe to explore in the future, and I can talk about this when we talk more about what the Gender Identity Task Force is working on, but they'll have a legal sex box, and then they'll say like gender identity, man, woman, trans, other, where students can at least, first of all, I think whenever you have a form that everybody sees that has a term like transgender on it, it's in a very easy way passively raising consciousness and awareness about the existence of this identity.
Absolutely, I would agree. Now, you had talked a little bit about the Gender Identity Task Force. We have a short little time left, so I want to be able to kind of tackle what they're working on this year and what they want to work on in the future.
So what we're working on this year, and this is a continuation to what we started working on last year, is looking at our policies, and like I said, this is a really interdisciplinary cross-campus group of folks. Looking at national best practice on college campuses and universities for supporting transgender students, and then trying to increase education and awareness. And that's through doing trainings on transgender issues for students, but also for staff and faculty. And one thing that we started last year, and hopefully will be live very shortly, is an electronic transgender training designed for staff.
Oh, so you're looking to do some online training, so to speak.
As well.
Okay.
With the goal that staff members who take this, it would be relatively short online training, might find how this is relevant to the work that they do, because I think a lot of times folks who work in different departments where they're not necessarily dealing, they're not in the LGBTQ office, they might think, how is this relevant? And I think after a short online training, hopefully they'd be invested enough to say, oh, this is relevant, or this is interesting, and maybe I can go to the next staff and faculty training. So
let me ask you this question. So if I'm a faculty, a staff member out there, or a student who is interested in your center, interested in the trainings you might do, is there a place where we can find your information?
Absolutely. Our website, which is socialjustice.rutgers.edu. My information's there. If you're someone who would like to participate in the next staff training we have on transgender issues, shoot me an email and I will put you on the list for when we do the next training. If you're interested in being a staff or faculty liaison, again, you can send me an email and I'd be happy to add you to the list.
And where's the new resource located again? The new center?
It is located on Livingston campus in Tillett Hall, room 247.
All right, and so anything else you want us to kind of know about transgender issues, LGBTQ issues on campus that you haven't already given us?
Well, I will say there are a lot of allies on campus, and I think that's really strong and really wonderful.
Important.
And as a fairly new staff member, in my second year coming here, I've been so impressed by how many folks across this very large university have a larger level of awareness. I think one thing we should be thinking about as we're constantly adapting is that more students are self-identifying as transgender before they get to school. More students are aware of what it means to be transgender because of the internet, because pop culture shows like America's Next Top Model, The Real World are having transgender characters on. And so I think that in some ways the students are coming at a higher level of awareness sometimes than the staff who might not have been exposed to the same images in pop culture, same resources in terms of the internet as well. So constantly adapting.
All right, great. Well, Jenny, at this particular point, we got to wrap. But I want to thank you for being here. It's been very enlightening and extremely educational. And hopefully we'll have you back again to talk about some of the future work of the Gender Identity Task Force. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Joining me today is Sherry Ann Butterfield, Associate Professor of Sociology within the College of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers Newark. Welcome, Sherry Ann.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm glad to have you here. Today we want to jump right in. So you've done a lot of your research on second-generation immigrants and the conversations in terms of how they straddle the complexity of the country of origin and being in the U.S. A lot of your research focuses around West Indian women. So can you give me some of the challenges they face and some of what your research has already identified with that population?
Okay, so some of the basic issues is that as phenotypically black-looking immigrants, they're straddling the world between African-American experience and the West Indian experience. And so how they negotiate that becomes very problematic based on how they're perceived. And as issues around womanhood and womanness and femininity, those issues get complicated from home culture and host culture.
So let's take this for a second.
Okay.
I'm a white man.
Yes.
I obviously don't live as a black woman or as a West Indian woman. So can you give me some of the challenges that really sit between trying to straddle the African American experience and the West Indian women experience?
Okay, so in terms of being very dedicated to the home, and being very dedicated to taking care of the men in the home.
Okay.
That is one. But at the same time, being highly encouraged to go to school, and not just go to school, but go to college and get professional degrees. And so what does that look like when you're also expected to take care of the people in the home? And so there's some challenges about not necessarily wanting to being allowed to leave home to go to college, for example. So what happens if you're confined to a particular geographical area that may or may not give you access to different kinds of lifestyles?
Okay.
And so those things sort of happen. You know, one of the basic things that the people that I talk to like to say is you still have to make a plate for your father, your brother, your husband, your partner.
Okay.
At the same time, being expected to have this career that's sort of upward mobility.
So one of the things too I'm also interested in, a lot of the West Indian women that you interviewed, do they still live in predominantly West Indian communities, or do they live in African American communities, or can the outside person who's not West Indian tell the difference?
They predominantly live in West Indian communities that actually often straddle African American communities. And so, for example, a lot of the work I do is in New York, and so you have Brooklyn, for example. So Flatbush, which used to be at one time predominantly African American, is now predominantly West Indian, but you still have some African American communities still there. And so how do those two communities negotiate each other is also, it gets very complicated. And the same thing is going on actually in Newark as well. So there are West Indian communities living particularly in the South Ward of Newark, and sort of how they negotiate what's been categorized as an African American city. Well,
that's what I was going to get to. You know, Newark has a legacy of being an African American city and being very open to the African American conversation and community. So how long have West Indian folks been in South Newark, and kind of what's the community like there? Because it's not one we hear about.
It's not one, and it's relatively small, but enough where there are some tensions going on that the community is talking about, but not on a sort of city stage, for lack of a better term. Just thinking in terms of their being recent, we're not talking about very long, probably the past 15, 20 years.
And especially Newark history, that's relatively
new. Short period of time, and not one that the census can capture either. If you do every 10 years, they're too small to get an accurate count. And so one of the things that my research is pushing for us is sort of get a sense of what Newark looks like. Because it's not just that West Indian community in Newark that's changing, it's the city as a whole. And so the Latino population, the Portuguese community, and Brazilian that we haven't had a good count of either. And so the city is changing. And so if all those communities are trying to negotiate each other and themselves. And so in terms of what's going on in the Central South Ward with those communities, it's really, there's issues of language, force. I mean, it's English patois sometimes, but there's also a Haitian community.
Right.
We were talking about French and French Creole. We're also talking about there's a new West African immigration into that same area. And so, you know, there are issues around education in particular, and that's where a lot of the tensions come. How do you deal with an immigrant child versus an African American child, even though a lot of the issues are similar? But the immigrant experience is slightly different about how parents actually fundamentally trust teachers to do what needs to be done, take care of a student.
Okay.
Whereas as Americans, we're trained where you need to be more proactive in your child's education.
Right.
And so those kinds of tensions kick in quite a bit.
Besides Newark, are there other major population centers of West Indian folk in New Jersey?
There's some in Trenton that no one ever really talks about, which I find fascinating.
So we can talk about it. Let's talk about it.
It's a sizable community, and I'm not actually clear how they ended up in Trenton of all places, but they are there. And so those communities who actually try to talk to each other, so they're migrant communities. What I find fascinating is that New York is no longer the main spot. So people will go from Northeast New Jersey to Trenton, and there's a move into South Jersey and closer to Philadelphia. So there's also a population there. And so part of that, I think, is people just sort of getting, once you have a family member somewhere, the connection sort of just
kind of happens there.
Just kind of happens.
One of the things I do know about the West Indian population, especially from the Caribbean, is the conversation around the identity with the island from which you
Right.
from which you hail. And so the conversation is now when West Indian women are coming to the United States, while they have island identity, they also have West Indian identity. So I know I got a little bit more complex there.
No, it's good.
But can you talk a little bit more about, you know, what it means to have in a community where some folks might be from St. Lucia, some folks might be from Dominica, some folks might be from Jamaica, St. Croix.
It becomes an island fight, really. And so the conversations happen around who comes from a bigger island, the issues around supposedly Jamaica representing all of the Caribbean, and so other islands have serious issue with that.
Okay.
The issues really around people also not, in America's not understanding what the Caribbean looks like, particularly racially. So if they meet someone who's Southeast Asian and they say they're from Trinidad, and people really, or Chinese Jamaican, people sort of,
okay, they don't get that, right?
They don't get that, and so there becomes a sort of global identity around Caribbean-ness,
right?
In terms of the reactions to other people. But when they're by themselves, they're very clear that you're from Trinidad, I'm from Guyana. And we can bond over similarities, but there's also a history of some of these islands not getting along with each other. And so how do we deal with that? Well, second generation, not as much as the first fight about.
More so much first generation, you said, so not second. Yeah. One of the things I also want to be able to talk about is in the Caribbean island, there's also U.S. territories. Yes, U.S. territories versus folks who are non-U.S. territories. So how does that conversation specifically lead to immigrating in the United States along citizenship issues?
That's actually really interesting. I think one of the things that's sort of driving a lot of that is sort of perceptions of violence in the Caribbean, which ones are sort of the slave to, and slave is an interesting word, slave to U.S. power. And so those who tend to be from the U.S. Virgin Islands have a very different experience, very class differential experience than those from the others. And those tensions still happen about, well, you know, I can maintain citizenship in both places, and I do because I feel tied to, but at the same time, there's some really bad things happening in my island, and I probably need to leave. Like when Guyana in particular has experienced a serious out-migration of Guyanese, and at one point there was a sense that more Guyanese people were leaving than actually staying in there, and it was around issues of violence, but also issues of relations of what was going on with the U.S. in terms of the economy.
Well, and I also know socioeconomics plays into this, because when we're looking at folks who are West Indian in terms of socioeconomic class, in terms of the island or immigration, there's the conversation of socioeconomic status on the island and socioeconomic state in the United States. So can you talk a little bit more about what that difference is like too?
That difference is interesting. If you follow, actually, the year of migration becomes really interesting. So those West Indians who came over, particularly right after, well, post-6 1965, I'll just put it that way.
All right.
And those tended to be the more educated, or just had more cultural capital and social capital. So they may not have been highly educated, but they had money sort of saved up.
All right.
And so their children tended to do better because they're also coming from a better background. The ones that are immigrating now have a very different class status. They're less educated, they have less resources. And so those are people who also find themselves using, for example, the social welfare system in America, where the previous generation would have said they would have never done that.
All right.
And so those class tensions are also playing themselves out in interesting ways. And it happens with every migrant group, of course. But so what's going to be interesting is seeing how that continues to the differentials. For example, there was an article in the New York Times several years ago about how the black population in Ivy League schools tend to have a serious second generation West Indian population.
I was going to ask about that because I remember
that and so it got rather heated because African Americans were saying, well, if affirmative action is really based on the experiences of African Americans in the U.S., how are these black immigrants coming and sort of benefiting in a way that they may not necessarily have been, and a lot of that had to do with the resources that were available to the second generation's parents, and also the networks they formed in a lot of these areas. I mean, these parents worked in places and worked with people who knew how to get to these schools.
Well, it sounds to me as though there are similarities to the second generation Jewish experience with a lot of Jewish immigrants coming right after World War II and after World War I in terms of the conversation, in terms of settling, being able to network, being able to use hard work and saving money for access.
Absolutely.
And understanding the network possibilities that exist in those areas.
I mean, that's one of the questions about migration research in general, is sort of, is it really that different from the turn of the 20th century? And one of the challenges, particularly with when you look at black immigration, is really thinking about the impact of race. And so what happens when a group is racialized very differently than, or not so differently than Jews were initially, and Italians and the Irish were initially, but what happens when there is another community that they're sort of assumed to be a part of? And what are the tensions if they sort of disassociate themselves from this group? Not saying that we don't have common experiences, but there are also differential experiences as well.
Well, and also speaking about the race issue, a lot of West Indian women don't have a conversation about whether they consider themselves Black or African American in the U.S. context.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I always encourage my students to remember as well is that the messages about African Americanness, and particularly American Blackness, gets communicated worldwide before anyone gets here. So all immigrants are coming with a particular lens and stereotypes about what African Americans do. So there's an automatic resistance to, I don't want to be associated with these people, because in my country I learned that they were supposedly lazy, they were uneducated, they sit on the adult, and so those tensions happen. And it's not until people have been here, I realize, as I'm doing the work, at least 10 years of and actually watch the experience happen, that their attitude changes. And so it's, oh, they do work hard, but then they face these barriers because of race. And so the women find themselves in a very interesting way in which they're sort of, I have to rethink some of my preconceived notions based on my own experiences.
All right. I also know the conversation, too, about recognizing when in the U.S. you're Black.
Yes.
And when in the conversation you start to realize when you're West Indian, what your ethnicity is. Can you explain a little bit of difference about how that happens with West Indian women when they realize that they're first Black as opposed to learning that you're Black in the U.S.?
When they can't get access to anything. Well, it's just, I shouldn't say anything, but initially it's really around, and for the women that I talk to, school is the first place that happens.
All right.
And so they're in school and they're asked to speak about Black History Month. Perfect example.
Great. Black
History Month, and so the teacher usually says, well, can you talk about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks? And I have no concept of that.
Not their history.
And then it's, so what are you saying? Why are you not aware of this? And say, oh, you're reading me as Black. Okay. There's a particular woman that I talked to I thought was interesting. She was in a AP history class in high school. This issue comes up. And there are only three Black, and they're all Black women in the class, and they're West Indian women. And the teacher asked about Black History Month, and they all sort of looked at her and said, none of us can speak to that. Right. One was Jamaican, one was Haitian, one was from Panama.
So their experience clearly wasn't that.
Clearly was not that. But the teacher just said, well, how is that? How do you still not know what the Black experience is? And so in that moment, you're sort of confronted with, well, what is my, so am I not Black? Am I Black in kind of, and those kinds of ways. And so, and in that context, where if they're the only Black people in that space, what does the teacher then think about African Americans, right? So why are they not in this AP class? So those tensions happen quite a bit.
So those tensions happen, and then you're faced as that woman in that classroom.
Who has to speak for an entire race and ethnic group.
So. Lots of complex issues to talk about. I appreciate the fact that you're here today, but we're short on time, so we need to wrap up. Okay. So I want to say thanks very much. It was great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. This has been fabulous.
Good. Well, that's all the time we have on this edition of Breakfast at the Barracks. For more information about this subject or any other topic we discussed here today, please visit our website at rutgers.tv. For all of us here at the Rutgers Division of Continuing Studies, I'm Bill Leipold, and thanks for watching.